Hi, I'm Steve Justice. I want to talk to you today about what it takes to enable an organization that is tasked with innovation. I retired in 2017 after a near 4 decade career, the last 33 of which were at Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. I ran the Advanced Design Organization, multiple programs and campaigns. But also, one of the things that allows me to provide this set of perspectives was I was the unofficial historian for the organization. And so I had access to the founder of the Skunk Works, Kelly Johnson, his personal logs. I got to talk and work with many of the grandfathers of the Skunk Works, and I was part of watching that organization evolve from 1984 until 2017. I'm going to share with you today the lessons that I collected, the observations that I made, and have compiled into this recommendation for an innovation organization. The challenge you have in front of you is enormous because we have near peer threats that are operating inside of our development decision loops using advanced technologies and quite honestly, in some cases, our own technologies against us in an incredibly complex battle space and a battle space that is increasing in complexity, but under the pressure of ever increasingly tight budgets and threats that are able to operate to different rules than we are. But this isn't the first time we face this. World War II put us on the wrong side of innovation surprise. This image shows 8th Air Force B-17s over Germany with one of the primary defenses of anti-aircraft artillery. One of the things that's not captured in this photo, of course, is fighter planes, but because of the threat that the 8th Air Force represented to German industry and the war effort, the the technologists were coming up with all sorts of ideas, including rocket-powered interceptors. Over on the left, the Bockham Natter, and then the Me-163 that had rates of climb that even today are breathtaking, but also the development and fielding of surface-to-air missiles, and one that was particularly interesting to me, the airborne infrared detection system to deal with the nighttime bombing campaign that Britain was holding. But one of the threats really worried war planners, and that was the Me-262. They first picked up wind of it in 1943, and the Air Force leadership felt that if they could not do something about the jets, if they appeared in large numbers, that they might have to stop the daylight bombing offensive. And you can see the quote from General Spaatz here. And the real threat here was, we'd gone into Europe, and now we had the large ground campaign, and the Eighth Air Force was tasked with wearing down not only German defenses, but also to disrupt their ability to create war machinery. If we couldn't do that, then that threatened the whole ground operation. And I captured a couple of comments here from U.S. air crews or Allied air crews. But a friend of mine from the Skunk Works was a tail gunner in a B-17 and saw several of the jets, of the Me-262s. And he said the speed was unbelievable. It was truly a threat to them because it represented such an unknown and technological leap. Kelly Johnson saw the challenge that existed, came back to Hull Hibbard, the chief engineer, and said, I think we can do something about this. He had a contract with the U.S. Army Air Corps to develop a prototype jet fighter that would be turned into a production system in very short order. They challenged them with, I think, originally 120 days for the prototype from go ahead to first flight. And Kelly said, I want to apply this idea I've had for a while of an experimental department. and basically set up an environment where everybody was together and we had have rapid decision making and really close on developing a technological breakthrough very quickly. So this was a new operational construct. And Hall said that's great, but you can have no people, no equipment, no facilities. So Kelly set up a very small operation down at the south end of one of the plants. Actually bought a machine shop in Burbank, hired all the employees because the main plant was producing an aircraft almost every hour, and Kelly was admonished to not disrupt that. This is the actual implementation schedule, and you hear about 125 days and 120 days and that kind of thing, 180 days for the production bird. But the metric that really got me was from the start of configuration design, which happened before the contract award, until their first flight was 237 days. And this was to create a jet fighter, so you're using different fuels than you would normally use in a propulsion system that you had virtually no experience with, flying at speeds that represented stability and control problems for the P-38. They were reaching those kind of speeds in a dive, but you're going to be doing that in level flight here. So the contract performance was absolutely incredible, and it spawned a DNA that Kelly implemented, and this is a summary on the left of the rules that you see here captured in the image on the right. In addition to having a set of expectations that was defined for the Skunk Works, one of the other elements that was really critical to this was having the expectations over time. Kelly ran the Skunk Works from 1943 to the mid 70s. And so you had 30 years of continuous expectations and consistent expectations. And when Ben Rich took over for Kelly, Ben carried those expectations forward until 1990. So you had nearly 50 years of continuous and constant expectations for what the Skunk Works was that really cemented a DNA inside the organization. I call it DNA instead of culture because culture is people. So as people come and go and you get the different generations in, you're going to have culture evolve. And the Skunk Works has evolved. There is no doubt about that. But the core DNA elements are what is really critical in defining the operation. There are some myths associated with the Skunk Works, such as its processes are applicable to all programs, and it's not. You would never want to try to attempt a program like the F-35 using Skunk Works processes. In addition to that, one of the things I heard from multiple people, outside the inner circle, was that the Skunk Works had access to unlimited funding, and that just isn't true. The development budget for the F-117 was less than half of that of the F-16, which was developed at the same time, and it represented this huge technology breakthrough. But the Skunk Works does not ensure success. When you look through the history of the programs, there were programs that Kelly actually told the customer to cancel and gave money back on because it didn't make any sense. And so it's not a guarantee of success. One of the other things that I always thought was interesting was the perception that the Skunk Works left out important steps. And I will tell you, the amount of rigor that I saw put into the engineering and program management process rivaled anything else that you would see out there. But what was different about it was that it had focused on important tasks. It wasn't doing every task, it was doing the important ones. The other thing that truly impressed me was the level of documentation that the Skunk Works created before PowerPoint existed. Some of the reports developed on the Blackbird were breathtaking in their detail and allowed us to use them on downstream programs, use the engineering data on downstream programs. And yet, here they were in this massive 32-month from go-ahead to first flight on the Blackbird, and yet they were writing these incredible documents that gave us huge insight into the complexities of high-speed propulsion systems and high-speed stability and control. Another perception is that there was no process control inside of it, and it was streamlined. There's no doubt about it, but there were processes and they were documented. And lastly, the Skunk Works has always had strategy associated with it about what you do go after and what you don't go after, what is Skunk Works aligned, what is not Skunk Works aligned, and the best way to execute that program. So, in trying to condense down all the elements of what make up the DNA of an innovation organization today, based on what I learned from the history of the Skunk Works and modern execution environments, you need to enable freedom of operation. It needs to be a protected environment because lots of people inevitably want to come in and help, but you can't let just anybody in. There are very well-meaning people that want to come in and help that will slow the process down, and we'll get to one of the other critical elements that they disrupt here in just a minute, and I'll point that out. The next element is you have to trust leadership in here. At the Skunk Works, the program manager had absolute control of his program, but it also meant that the program manager had absolute accountability. I saw multiple program managers replaced because they did not perform. That there were failures, and failures are tolerated to a certain degree, but there are some failures that are not tolerated, and the program manager was accountable for everything that took place on his program. But the program manager also needed to set up this ability to allow the team to take chances and fail successfully. One of the things I always told my team is, I want you to despise failing. I want you to hate it with every fiber of your being, but I don't want you to fear it, because as soon as you fear failing, it changes your decision-making process and you become more timid in decision-making. And that really limits innovation. The next thing is a clear organizational structure. And I referred to this as RAD: roles, responsibilities, accountability, and decision-making boundaries. For an organization and every box on an organization, these elements would be defined. And what that does is it allows you to very quickly assess overlaps and duplication and eliminate any of those. I would then take the RAD and brief the entire program on it so that they knew who to go to for what, who was responsible for what, how the accountability chain worked, as well as who was responsible for making what decisions. And that really sped up a critical element that's coming up here. The next is, as I mentioned earlier, is focus on what's important. One of Kelly's admonitions was one miracle per program. And that's great, but often there's multiple miracles. The Blackbird was a testimony to everything being a miracle. But in looking at this, another element of that, in deciding what's important, you need to be very discriminating in a need versus a want. And the example I would give my teams is a human needs air, water, and a little bit of food, and shelter. Sometimes that's arguable, but I believe shelter is important too. Everything else is a want. It makes life better, it makes life more enjoyable, but it is not part of keeping a human alive. So now that's vicious, because quality of life is a very important play, but that's the level of scrutiny that needs to take place when managing a program. And it's that separation of need from all of the chaff of the wants out there. Another element is an outcome mindset, the right people in the right place at the right time. As I often heard early in my career, the bosses talk about a good hunter is not necessarily a good trapper, is not necessarily a good skinner. And so you would see teams transition actually over the different phases of a program to make sure you had the right mindset in the right domain. But one of the things that was consistent that I always heard was the mindset of, you assume it can be done. One of the things I really admired about the grandfathers, they never assessed whether or not something could be done. When they were given a challenge, they just assumed it could be done and figured out how to do it. That's a really different way of looking at the problem, and it's critical when you're dealing with unknowns. The strong involved program management is critical, not only for that protection element, that protected environment like I talked about, but you need to have the rigor in the planning, the rigor in execution. As I would tell my teams, budgets and schedules are not suggestions. They need to be treated as absolutely sacred. And it takes a very strong program manager to do that without micromanaging. That's one of the toughest things in the world because micromanaging is very easy, but it is counterproductive. Empowered teams are important, and giving a team the ability to execute is really important. And that leads to this last element of rapid decision making. Empowering a team and allowing decisions to be made at the lowest possible level is critical. If a decision always has to be made at the top level, it means that information has to be flowed up. And as my boss has always said, a good decision today is better than a great decision 2 weeks from now. Kelly even would go so far as to say a bad decision today is better than a great decision 2 weeks from now because it was about maintaining program momentum. You're always going to have ambiguities and uncertainties. And if you make a decision, you'll very quickly find out whether it's right or wrong, but you have to have that protected environment of failing successfully in order to enable this. And so that's where this managed risk approach comes in here, where you go through and identify the things that are real risks, those needs from a risk standpoint, move everything else into a watch category and manage those things very closely. And rapid decision making is a real key to not only identifying risks, but also identifying risk and managing them over time. The other threats to execution that exist is a one size fits all to acquisition management. I've got a pony shaped cookie cutter. Guess what happens? It means I only get pony shaped cookies. One of the things that I truly valued about the processes we had at the Skunk Works, there was kind of a library of processes, and then our leadership team would take those when we were given a program challenge and tailor the processes to that program. You can read some of these, and I think we've talked about a number of them, but I want to skip down to the middle here in the desire for more data and creating data not used in decision making. One of the things that Kelly implemented was something called a decision book. And so for I'll call them significant decisions on a program, there was a sheet that was filled out, and it was done by all the principals that would be involved in the decision, and it captured what the challenge was, what the alternatives were, an assessment of the alternatives. It was followed by a discussion, a spirited discussion, as I'll say from my experience, about what the decision should be and why it should be that. But in the end, the decision maker was left with the decision, and everybody that was involved in the decision signed the sheet, and it was put in a notebook. And that led to the ability to minimize the number of decision revisits that you had because typically you wanted to not have second guessing. You wanted to enable in an environment that would allow you, if there were a setback or a failure of some type, to revisit a decision, but you didn't want it done again out of fear or second guessing because you needed to maintain program momentum. And again, establishing a proper DNA in an organization can address many of these threats to execution. So, as we talked about on the front end, the near peer threats that we are dealing with today, fielding systems quicker than us, that means speed of decision making. And this is not only in the technical world, but it's in the programmatic and acquisition side as well. When we look at the adversaries using technologies against us, first of all, protecting what it is we're doing, and then the speed of deployment. So let's get inside of their development cycles. That requires a different mindset to do that. We cannot do that with the approaches that we have for acquisition and development right now. The complexity of the battle space increasing means that we need revolutionary approaches, not evolutionary. I remember years ago when we started talking about the sixth generation fighter, I had one customer gave us a set of requirements that were essentially 1.5 times an F-22, and that's not a technology loop. That's stressing a system, but that's not doing a generation leap. And this is where you have to have that risk-taking revolutionary mindset to step out into that future and look at the problem in a very different way. Budget constraints means that you can't do business as usual. You've got to find ways to streamline what it is you do. And then lastly, in here, operating to different rules, you have to think differently. I remember after 9/11, the Pentagon called in some Hollywood script writers to say, what are some ways that terrorists might actually come in and attack us? Because they were so entrenched in their thinking. If you remember, our interceptors launched out over the water because nobody expected the threat to come from within our own borders. I held workshops and I participated in workshops where we brought in people from the commercial world and entertainment industry to provide fresh perspectives, just to make sure that we weren't missing something that was obvious to other people but not obvious to us because our thinking had become artificially constrained. If you saw me speak at the LEDx 3.0 at the Airner University, that's online. If you want to see it, I used a thought example there, and I would encourage you to go watch that and look at that thought example for how we can subconsciously become trapped in a thought process. So innovation is going to be a key element of maintaining the supremacy that we need to have to ensure that the interests of the United States are always protected. And I'll leave you with these parting thoughts. In addition to thinking in a revolutionary context, many times we don't go back and look at the assumptions and ground rules out there. Again, there can be something that we just take for granted, that if we go back and play with the assumptions and play with the ground rules, there's huge amounts of opportunity space there. So I would encourage you to go look in the shadows of those rather than just taking them at face value. And then in dealing with what will inevitably go wrong, responding rather than reacting, and those are two very different things. It's really human to react. Leaders have to respond. And that means thoughtful approaches to dealing with issues. You have to also be disciplined in what you do have the ability to control. As they always say, you can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond to it. Well, there's elements of a program you control. And you have to be disciplined in that domain. And then when the failures happen, you have to be resilient. The worst thing in the world you can do is buckle at that critical point in time. And then lastly, keeping in mind that success is often the product of persistence. Just as Winston Churchill said, never give up. And so with that, I hope this provided a glimpse of insight into what it takes to establish an innovation organization and lead one. And I really look forward to the Q&A session. Have a great day.